I'll hand you over to Mark Nicholson, who is our principal consultant at Indesser, who is going to take you through the paper Treating Customers Fairly, How a Single Customer View of Debtors Could Transform the Collection of Public Sector Debt. Mark.
Thank you, James, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, this is our 9th webinar. And one I'm particularly interested in because this is a particular passion of mine. And unlike many of the other webinars we've run on key topics, this is one where there's no simple off-the-shelf solution or range of solutions that could be delivered. It is a highly complex issue, and I'll describe some of the issues that surround it as I go through the presentation, but one that I'm convinced is still worthwhile achieving. So on to the background to the requirement for a single customer view of debtors. Despite recent increases and improvements in the way government debt is collected, the latest whole of government account show that there's still something in the region of £24 billion of debt owed to government. So still work to be done. But you don't need me to tell you that debt is a highly diverse and complex issue. So across both central and local government, there could be something as many as 500 different public entities that have debts owed to them, from benefit overpayments, child maintenance arrears, non-payment of vehicle tax, outstanding court fines, council tax and other sundry debts, a vast and diverse range of different debt types. And most public sector organisations who are looking to address that debt and recover it will often perform a check with credit reference agencies or other data suppliers to see what the debtor owes to the private sector in order to identify issues such as financial vulnerability, to identify whether they are likely to be able to pay the debt, to perform tracing and other checks that help inform the debt recovery strategies and provide a clear and holistic view of the individual and how the debt might be collected. Perversely, though, there is no way very often for those same organisations to see how much the debtor owes to either other departments within the same organisation or other organisations across the public sector. So you can imagine a local authority looking to collect council tax, but not necessarily having a view of the other types of debt that might be owed to the local government, such as rent arrears or parking fines or whatever other sundry debts that might be out there. And they certainly don't have a view across other public sector organisations, so DWP or HMRC or HMCTS or Child Maintenance Group will not have that view. And therefore they are collecting debts in silos without that complete understanding of the person's ability to pay. And that's really where a single customer view of debtors would bring things together, by bringing multiple debts that a citizen owes to government and thus enabling more informed strategies to be applied and operational decisions to be made about how that debt should be collected. So a simple proposition, but as I said, it has its problems. The first problem, which is there's no empirical evidence about the extent to which an individual has multiple debts across the public sector. You'll see there from the quote that the Christians Against Poverty identify that multiple government debts are common among the highly vulnerable. And that's probably the best information I have found. 1 in 2, 49% of their clients owe debts to multiple organisations. But there is always the question, well, is that a demographic that applies across the board? Does that apply to other organisations? And to be frank, we just don't know. And that really is something that needs to be addressed. So moving on to slide 3. The concept of a single customer view, however, is not a new one, and it's certainly not one that I've made up. There has been plenty of calls for such a thing to be created, and it's probably something like 6 years now since it was first mooted. So there was a Committee of Public Accounts who produced a report managing debt owed to central government in 2014, and they identified that public sector departments don't have this single view that I refer to. When TDX Group responded to the government's procurement for a debt market integrator, one of the things that we proposed within our response was that we could use our data analytical capabilities to create such a view, and sharing data across multiple departments. To be honest, that has not ever really been taken up, and a lot of the work that we do with various government organisations, including many of you on the phone today, it still remains collected in different siloed groups. More recently, the National Audit Office published a report on tackling problem debt, and again identified that identifying individuals who owe money to different departments risks poor value for money, as there is nothing to prevent debt teams competing for repayments. And that clearly is the issue. If I'm trying to recover my debt, and James is trying to recover his debt, we are both trying to collect money from the same person. We're duplicating processes, and neither of us has a view over each other's activity. And very recently, the Centre for Social Justice, in their document, Collecting Dust, A Path Forward for Government Collection, referenced the fact that a centralised debt aggregator could be created within the Cabinet Office's debt management function in order to reach a single customer view. And they talked about applying it to cases, complex cases with more than 2 government debts. So you'll be relieved to know it's not just me calling for this thing. I'd like to think that many on the call would be in favour of this process, but evidence is building up as to the fact that this would be something worth doing. We move on to slide 4. Well, if nothing or little has changed over the last 6 years, why do it now, perhaps? Well, I think there are indicators that may mean that this is an appropriate time to do it. I talk about the fact that the public sector has made advances in the way that it collects debt, and that includes the use of more advanced data and analytics. And so, following on from that, a single customer view of debtors is, to me, I think, a logical next step. But clearly, you need the correct legislation to provide that. And many of you will be familiar, no doubt, with the extended data sharing powers that were introduced in the Digital Economy Act 2017, in particular Section 48, which talks about the disclosure of information to reduce debt owed to the public sector. So there is a beginning there of a process and the legislation, as I say, to support the data sharing that would allow a single customer view to be created. The COVID-19 crisis is likely to result in an increase in public sector debt. Unfortunately, some people, as they have less expenditure and don't go out much, are clearly in a slightly better financial status, at least in the short term. But I think that one of the most sad effects of the COVID-19 crisis is that there will be an increase in public sector debt as the furlough support may be withdrawn, and every day there seems to be a new story about people being laid off and people who maybe historically have not suffered debt suddenly find themselves in a position where they do owe debt to government. So having the best possible view of the debtors and using new data and analytics that identifies recent debtors and new debtors is going to help in that regard. And many of you again might be aware, just yesterday the Cabinet Office has published a call for evidence on fairness in government debt management, and there's a lot of interesting things in there, and it's going to be interesting to see what response they get back to that call for evidence later this year that might support the concept of a single customer view. So as I said at the outset, it sounds on the face of it that it is a good idea, and I think there are a number of benefits that could be derived from having one. And I touched on this at the outset. Having a single customer view of debtors would provide a better understanding of the debt owed to the government and of the financial status of citizens who are in debt. And that will enable a number of things that I'll describe, but it might also help identify debt that is unrecoverable and so could potentially be written off if that was permitted within your organisation. But if we focus on the recovery of that debt, then as an extension of what we currently do to enrich client data, analyze it, segment it, and then develop and implement fair and appropriate treatment strategies, having a single customer view of debtors would certainly enhance that. The first area would be to provide that more informed prioritization of debt cases. So it might be that Mark Nicholson has a number of smaller debts. Those debts never get prioritized. Organizations just never get round to recovering those debts because resources are restricted. There's only so much you can do, and therefore that debt never gets collected. However, by looking at a single customer view, if you bring all those debts together, you might actually identify that Mark Nicholson is one of your most prolific debtors, and I assure you I'm not. But if I were, then by bringing all that data together, then you would have that ability to see that and understand that and act accordingly. There are bound to be efficiency savings. Organizations clearly are all undergoing their own debt recovery processes, be it local authorities or central government. They're all sending out letters, they're sending out enforcement agents. There's all sorts of processes that you'll know better than I. And so bringing all that together to say, you know what, we're only going to do that once because we know that Mark Nicholson only needs to be told once. And if you bring all that together in a single letter and say, Mark Nicholson, you owe this much government debt, then again, that I think brings more focus to the process and leads to significant savings in costs and allows you to deploy your own internal resources much more effectively. It would also lead to more sustainable payment plans. It would be very easy for an individual organisation to say, I'm going to negotiate a payment plan with Mark Nicholson, but if the payment plan is not based on a true understanding of his entire financial position, and I am aware of things like the single financial statement and other ways of trying to understand Mark Nicholson's financial status, but by looking at the fact that he owes debt to multiple government departments, then a more sustainable payment plan can be created that the debtor can buy into and that they can continue to pay based on a fair and equitable understanding of their financial status. And that in turn should lead to the collection of more debt. So what's equally important though is improving the principle of treating customers fairly and compliance with the Cabinet Office's fairness principles. And that does require the provision of a clear and transparent view of all debts that the citizen is owed. I talked about that would make it easier to adopt the standard financial statement. It would help implement breathing space measures more easily because you are fully aware of the person and the debt that they owe to government. And then quoting a line that gets repeated quite frequently within Indesser from Steve Coppard at the Cabinet Office, it's about getting people out of debt rather than debt out of people. By having this single customer view of debtors, you are able to implement fairer, more equitable and compassionate ways of supporting debtors back to financial stability. So yes, you can certainly help recover debt, but actually if you can provide help and assistance because you know that they have got multiple debts and they are clearly in a financially vulnerable position, if they are struggling, then you can provide help and support. And looking at the final box there, better identification of those citizens who are the most vulnerable in society, enabling appropriate action to be taken. Yes, you can place those debts or pass those debts or the debtors on to independent debt advice charities and other organisations who can help them recover their financial stability and position. So a number of benefits to be had, all of which are in line with everything that I'm sure you are trying to do in your day-to-day recovery of debt, but ones that could be so much done better if you had the single customer view of the debtor. So far it's all been very positive, but as I said at the outset, I fully appreciate that this is a complex issue and that there are an awful number of issues that need to be addressed prior to a single customer view of debtors being implemented. And so I've listed a number of those here. First of all, it's about participation. Clearly, maximum benefit would be derived if as many central and local government organisations agreed to participate. Some benefit could clearly be derived from a small number of organisations sharing data, but if you are truly, and I hate using this word, trying to obtain a holistic view of a debtor, And then the fact that you get maximum number of organizations participating in the single customer view brings that clearest understanding. I can only guess at the number of different databases and systems that you are deploying across your own organizations and across all the organizations in the public sector, all holding details of individual debtors, perhaps in a slightly different way, with different levels of data availability and how up-to-date the information is. And so if this is going to be made to work, it needs to work on a very clean and up-to-date copy of the debtor's information. So there will be an element of data matching and of data cleansing to make sure that the information is held as complete, so that if organization 1 has a particular view of Mark Nicholson and organization 2 has a slightly different one, maybe one has a more up-to-date address, a more up-to-date marital status, or whatever it might be, or maiden name and other names, then data matching needs to be applied to bring all that data together, because otherwise you are missing out on data that would contribute to a single customer view, or perhaps worse, that you would be factoring in data that then gave a false impression of the individual. So data matching and possibly data cleansing are key factors in making this work. But it certainly isn't a one-time only thing. I said, if you are looking to make informed decisions based on single customer view, then the need for that information to be absolutely up to date is key. So maintenance of the view is absolutely essential. Clearly, debt payments continue apace. The debtor might incur additional debts, they will make payments, there might be additional costs that need to be factored in. And so all that information needs to be used to bring the single customer view up to date, make sure that everybody has the same view of it, and then that up-to-date understanding and view of the individual is reflected both in the debt prioritization and in the treatment strategies that are applied. There's no point bringing up a debtor with to negotiate a debt payment plan based on some out-of-date information. Data enrichment remains important, I think, despite having a single customer view. And we work with you, a lot of you, as I said earlier, to enrich your data. So over and above information that might be shared across central and local government, that data, again, subject to the appropriate powers and legislation, can be enriched with data from third-party organizations such as credit reference agencies and others. And that will further embellish the single customer view. So the dream would be to have a view of the debtor that factored in both their public sector debts and their private sector debts, and then action could be taken accordingly. Getting on to some meatier issues now, as if those ones weren't hard enough. Prioritization of debt cases. A simple box, a simple text, but one that really needs a huge amount of thought to make this happen. Clearly, government already has this concept of priority and non-priority debts. And so when you do have a single customer view of Mark Nicholson and all the debts that he owes, how are you going to prioritize which debts get recovered? Because it may be that all of his debts might be considered non-priority, or they may be considered priority. It may be that organizations who have relatively lower value debts at the moment just never get to see the light of day because they don't feature in the prioritization. There are other bigger debts to be recovered. So if you said across central government, Mark Nicholson owed a lot of money to central government, then that will be fine. But if Mark Nicholson only owed money to lower organizations with lower value debts, it could be that debt never hits the top of the prioritization tree and so never gets collected. And so it's important then to factor these things in when you are looking to determine how you will prioritize your debt cases. It's then a matter of applying the appropriate debt treatment strategies. I talked about the fairness principles. It's important that those revamped debt collection strategies are applied, bearing in mind the efficiency savings that I mentioned at the outside, and finding the right balance between fairness for the taxpayer in ensuring that the debt is recovered, but also, as I said earlier, recognizing the vulnerability of some of our poorest citizens. And then finally, one of the equally complex issue, the allocation of the debt payments made. So if you identify that Mark Nicholson owes £1,000, say, across government, and you can persuade him to pay that full £1,000, then that money can be divvied up to all the organisations that Mark Nicholson owed debt to. However, if he was not able to pay £1,000, he was only able to pay £500 of the £1,000 debt, and then we need to consider very carefully how that £500 is divvied up. Is it divvied up on a pro rata basis? Is it handed out on an age basis? Whatever criteria there are for sharing that money across all the organisations. And again, if that is not done correctly, then some government organisations with unpaid debt may never get the debt that they would able to recover left to their own devices. So while that is a complex issue, there are some existing models that support fair and sustainable debt management plans, such as those managed by the debt charities, such as Step Change. And while it is a complex issue, as are all of these, I don't believe that any of these are insurmountable, and it's certainly not an excuse to put this on the too difficult to do category. It is worth achieving. I do think that the benefits outweigh the issues. So having laid out the benefits and the issues, is there a way that Indesser can help? Well, as many of you know, probably all of you know by now, we are a joint venture with the Cabinet Office, and we were created to help tackle issues of fraud, error and debt. And on this particular area, I do think we are in a unique position to help government, because we have relationships with many central and local government organisations. I think it's something in the region of 56 now. And so we are in a good position to be able to discuss these issues with you, to plan how they might be addressed, to consider some of the issues that I've outlined on the previous slide. And we would certainly be very happy to do that. We do have existing suppliers who can provide the cleansing and matching routines that would help ensure the quality of the debtor data that I outlined as being so fundamental. And being the debt market integrator, we already have extensive amount of debt that we already hold, and we can use that data potentially in combination with the advanced analytics to, first of all, determine the extent to which citizens do have multiple debts. I talked about there being no empirical evidence. Well, we would certainly like to work with many organisations on this call and others to analyse that debt, subject, and I do stress this very sincerely, subject to the approval of the debt owners, to say, well, let's have a look at the data that Indesser already holds across government. Can we shed some light on the extent to which an individual has multiple debts? But as I say, we would only do that with your approval. But it would mean that you wouldn't then have to provide us any further data for analysis. We could do that based on the information we already hold. We already are using data from other suppliers to provide that more holistic view of the debt owed by citizens. And while I said there's no silver bullet to solving this particular issue, we can use our supplier agnostic position to help government identify the best solution or best solutions to the creation and operation of a single customer view of debtors. I do stress that this is much more of an operational issue, I think, that needs to be addressed rather than a technological issue. There are elements of technology to it, as I've outlined, but I've also outlined very much how this is an operational issue. And then, as our team do already, we would be very happy to work with you on developing and maintaining these fair and effective treatment strategies that reflect a single customer view of the debtors in light of bringing that information together. So a whistle-stop tour of a quite complex issue. Some of you may have already seen the article I wrote published on the Indesser website. If you haven't, I would certainly recommend you go and have a look at that. That sheds a little bit more light on than perhaps I've remembered to address in the presentation. So please do have a look at that. Other than that, James, I'll pass back to you for any questions.
I genuinely think the debt management bill consultation, the call for evidence that's out now, is the right place to push this again. And you know, the single view of debt, And alongside the breathing space initiatives, I think it's going to start to build momentum, even if it's local momentum across single view within departments, within organisations like local authorities. That's got efficiency savings as well that Mark alluded to. So I know that there are pockets of government that are pushing forward single views at the moment and are seeing some gains, but it'd be interesting to see how this pans out. But if there are no more questions, we'll end it there. If you do want to have a follow-up with anyone from Indesser or amongst yourselves, then we're more than happy to coordinate any responses and share those as you see fit. But really, thank you again for your time today. Really appreciate all the questions asked. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.